On the 31st of July, 1960, the Federation of Malaya declared that the emergency was over. 7,000 Australians had served in it. 39 of them were on the Roll of Honor. The conflict had lasted 13 years, longer than any other overseas military commitment Australia made in the 20th century. There is no dedicated memorial to it on Anzac Parade in Canberra. Most Australians cannot identify the date set aside to commemorate it. The official history of the Australian involvement was published in 1996. The secondary history, published in 1989, is titled Mostly Unsung. That title is not a lament. It is a precise description of where this conflict sits in the national memory, and it has not become less accurate in the decades since. Tell me in the comments whether you have heard of the Malayan Emergency before today, because the first thing this story needs to establish is not what happened in Malaya. It is what the people who sent Australians there decided to call it, and why that decision, made in London in June of 1948, made everything that followed easier to forget. The man Australia eventually sent bombers to hunt in the Malayan jungle had been awarded the Order of the British Empire by the same government for fighting the Japanese alongside them. That is the first contradiction this story turns on. In the gap between what governments name things and what things actually are, a country can fight a 12-year war and then, with some administrative tidiness, put it down and walk away. On the 31st of July, 1960, the Malayan government issued its declaration, and the machinery of the emergency was set aside. The men who had served came home. No parades of the kind that had greeted the men of the Second World War. Nothing of the national controversy that would attend the men of Vietnam. Something quieter and harder to name. A country that had been watching other things, and which continued to watch other things, and which did not look back. The Australian War Memorial Roll of Honor records 39 names from the Malayan Emergency, 2 from the Royal Australian Navy, 29 from the Army, 8 from the Royal Australian Air Force. Of those 39, 15 died as a result of operations. The other 24 died of illness, accident, and causes the record groups under the heading of non-operational. A further 2 Australians died in operations on the Thai-Malay border after the emergency was declared over, operations that were not classified as warlike service until 1995, 35 years after the fact. Approximately 2,000 Australians served in those post-emergency border operations between 1960 and 1966. They are included in no major public account of Australian military history that a school student is likely to encounter. The 5 power defense arrangements between Australia, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, and the United Kingdom, still operative today, grew directly from relationships forged in those 13 years. The RAF base at Butterworth, built in part by Australian engineers, was handed to Malaysia in 1988. The security architecture of Australia's relationship with Southeast Asia was constructed, in significant part, by a conflict the national curriculum does not teach. The secondary historian's title remains the only public verdict that sticks, mostly unsung. A war that was not called a war was easy to set aside. The naming made the forgetting possible. That was, as this story will show, the intention from the beginning. They called it an emergency. The word was not chosen by strategists or historians. It was chosen by insurance companies. Not metaphorically, but literally. Lloyd's of London insured Malaya's rubber plantations and tin mines. London-based insurers would not pay out for damage incurred in a civil war. They would pay out for damage incurred in an emergency. The British colonial administration in Malaya, faced with a guerrilla insurgency on the morning of the 16th of June, 1948, chose the word that kept the premiums intact. On the morning of that day, 3 European estate managers were murdered at 2 separate plantations in the northern state of Perak, the Elfil estate near Sungai Siput. 3 young ethnic Chinese men, the opening shots of what would become a 12-year armed conflict. That evening, the British declared a state of emergency in several districts of Perak and Johor. By the 18th of June, the declaration covered all of Malaya. 5 days after that, the Malayan Communist Party and its affiliated organizations were declared illegal. The British Foreign Minister's Office produced an internal memorandum on terminology in 1950. The decision to describe the fighters as bandits and terrorists rather than insurgents or rebels, it noted, had been taken originally because of the insurance implications of the words. A colonial office official named J.D. Hyam issued a separate instruction. The term insurgent must not be used, as it might suggest a genuine popular uprising. In 1952, a Defense Ministry directive formalized the language. The fighters would be known henceforth as communist terrorists, abbreviated to CTs. The abbreviation became standard in every official document produced for the next 8 years. The people fighting the British had their own name for the conflict. They called it the Anti-British National Liberation War. The stakes driving the naming were not abstract. A Colonial Office report from 1950 identified Malaya's rubber and tin industries as the largest earners in the British Commonwealth. Malayan exports constituted 83% of the sterling block's dollar earnings. One British peer called Malaya the greatest material prize in Southeast Asia. Another noted that its rubber and tin had very largely supported the standard of living of the people of this country and the sterling area ever since the war ended. The colonial secretary in the post-war Labour government had been more direct. Significant interference with Malayan exports would gravely worsen the whole dollar balance of the sterling area. This was what was at stake, not democracy in the abstract, not the containment of communism in principle, though that framing served political purposes in Canberra as much as in London. Rubber, tin, sterling. The word emergency was chosen because it protected the insurance payout. It also, as a consequence noted in internal documents, allowed the colonial forces to operate outside certain obligations under the laws of war. Britain ratified the 1949 Geneva Conventions in 1957, partway through the emergency. The emergency's legal status as something other than a war had already established the framework within which British forces were operating. The origins of the conflict lay in a broken promise. During the Second World War, the Malayan Communist Party's armed wing had fought alongside British forces against the Japanese occupation. Britain had armed them, supplied them, and trained them through the Special Operations Executives Force 136. After the Japanese surrender in August of 1945, the British returned to Malaya with a new constitutional proposal called the Malayan Union, which would have granted citizenship to the ethnic Chinese population, comprising approximately 40% of the country. The Malayan Union was then withdrawn under pressure from the Malay aristocracy and the United Malays National Organization. The citizenship path it had promised was closed. The ethnic Chinese community, denied the political recognition the British had implied they would receive, found no formal avenue of redress. Some looked to the Malayan Communist Party, which had its own answer to what Malayan independence should look like. In 1948, the party's new Secretary General decided the political path was exhausted and the armed path was open. That Secretary General was a man named Ong Boon Hwa, known by his party name as Chin Peng. He was 24 years old. He had fought the Japanese as a teenager, been decorated by the British for doing so, and spent the intervening years watching the promises made to his community be progressively withdrawn. For his wartime service with Force 136, he had been awarded the Order of the British Empire. Britain subsequently revoked it and placed a reward of 250,000 Straits dollars on his head. The man whose forces the Australian Lincoln bombers would eventually hunt had been an OBE holder. The record holds this without apparent discomfort. The Australian government's involvement began not with a military assessment, but with a diplomatic request. In April of 1950, the British government asked whether Royal Australian Air Force units could be sent to Malaya. Prime Minister Robert Menzies hesitated. On the 19th of May, 1950, he announced a compromise. A transport squadron would be sent. Not bombers, not combat aircraft. Transport. The advance party of No. 38 Squadron RWOOF arrived in Singapore in June of 1950. They were available because they had just returned from the Berlin airlift, one Cold War emergency feeding directly into another. The same crews, the same aircraft, a different jungle. No. 38 Squadron's Dakotas began flying cargo runs, troop movements, supply drops to police posts in remote jungle clearings, and medical evacuations. Their airlifts were, in the words of the official record, essential. Troops operating deep in the jungle were entirely dependent on aerial resupply. Then the North Korean Army crossed the 38th parallel on the 25th of June, 1950. 2 days later, Cabinet decided that the Lincoln bombers of No. 1 Squadron Rayabayaf would also go to Malaya. Menzies told the Australian Parliament that events in the Malayan Peninsula are of vital concern to the security of this country, and that Malaya is a key point in the strategic region of which Australia is a main support area. Herbert Veer Evatt, leading the Labour opposition, offered a different assessment. Sending forces to Malaya, he said, will lead only to acute misunderstanding between the Asian peoples in Malaya and Australia. It will be easily misrepresented as an act of aggression. The record holds both positions. What it documents is what happened next. The emergency had been running for 6 months before any of this was decided. In those 6 months, one of the most consequential acts of the entire conflict had already taken place. Australia had no forces in Malaya when it happened. What happened was not in Australian newspapers. It was not discussed in the Australian Parliament. It would not be publicly examined for more than 40 years. On the 11th of December, 1948, a patrol of 14 men from G Company, 2nd Scots Guards, entered a settlement of ethnic Chinese rubber tappers at Sungai Remo, near the town of Batang Kali in the state of Selangor. They were accompanied by a Malayan special constable and 2 Chinese special branch detectives. The settlement housed rubber tappers, men, women, and children who worked the plantation. No weapons were found. The men were separated from the women and children. They were subjected to mock executions. 24 of them were then killed. Their homes were burned. The survivors were taken to a nearby town and left there. The official British account, issued immediately, stated that the victims were communist insurgents who had an ammunition cache and who had been shot while attempting a pre-planned mass escape. This account was false. The colonial attorney general who reviewed the case privately believed that mass public executions might deter other insurgents, and his review cleared the soldiers involved. An internal document from the British High Commission in Kuala Lumpur records officials briefing ministers that there was little point in taking testimony from Malaysian witnesses because they were untrustworthy, motivated by compensation, and it was doubtful they could recall events accurately. In 1970, 6 of the soldiers who had been at Batang Kali presented themselves first to the press and then to the Metropolitan Police to confess that the men had been murdered. The Scotland Yard investigation that followed was terminated prematurely by the government before charges could be considered. The officers conducting it described the reason for its termination as political. In 1992, the BBC broadcast a documentary called In Cold Blood, which included confessions from a former Scots Guards soldier and interviews with the Scotland Yard officers who had investigated the case. The documentary named the massacre as what it was. The British government agreed to reinvestigate in 2009. The High Court ruled in 2012 that an inquiry was not required because the massacre had occurred too long ago. The Supreme Court upheld that ruling in 2015. In 2025, the United Kingdom government sent a letter to the families of the victims, acknowledging that the killings were a tragedy and that the official account describing the victims as insurgents attempting to escape was incorrect. No public inquiry has been held. No charges have ever been brought. The letter is what the record now holds. The 77 years before it are also what the record holds. The historian Christopher Hale described Batang Kali as Britain's My Lai. The scale is different. The structure is the same. Soldiers kill unarmed civilians. An official account blames the victims. The cover-up is maintained for decades, and the government never faces accountability. This is the conflict Australia joined in June of 1950. In March of 1950, Lieutenant General Sir Harold Briggs had been appointed Director of Operations in Malaya. Retired from the British Army in 1948, recalled to active duty for this specific task. His diagnosis of why the emergency was not being won was methodical. The Malayan National Liberation Army survived in the jungle because approximately 500,000 people, predominantly ethnic Chinese, living on the jungle fringes without legal title to their land and outside the reach of the colonial administration, provided the insurgency with food, intelligence, money, and recruits. His solution was to move them all. The Briggs Plan went into effect on the 3rd of April, 1950. Under it, approximately 500,000 people, roughly 10% of the entire population of Malaya, were forcibly relocated from their homes into purpose-built enclosures the British called new villages. Each was surrounded by barbed wire. Watchtowers stood at the perimeter. Police posts controlled the single entry and exit. Movement in and out was strictly regulated. Food rationing was imposed so that no surplus could reach the insurgents in the jungle. In the most restricted settlements, a 22-hour curfew applied. Anyone outside the perimeter during curfew hours could be shot. The relocations were conducted without advance notice. The operation began before dawn at each settlement. The colonial official Edgar O'Ballance noted that secrecy was essential to success. Otherwise, the squatters would have disappeared into the jungle in mass flight. Each family took what they could carry. Their former homes were burned. 470,509 people were documented in the resettlement program, 400,000 of them ethnically Chinese. The Orang Asli indigenous communities were also targeted for forced relocation on the grounds that the British believed they supported the communists. 10,000 Malaysian Chinese were separately deported to the People's Republic of China in 1949 as suspected communist sympathizers. The new villages were not purely punitive by the account of those who constructed them. Schools were built. Medical dispensaries were provided. Piped water and electricity were installed. Locally elected village committees were established. The historian John Newsinger assessed that the inhabitants were effectively deprived of all civil rights. Both descriptions are accurate. It is possible to provide a school inside a barbed wire enclosure. The wire does not become less real for the presence of the school. The food denial worked. Patrols found 2 dead fighters in their mid-30s, carrying 3 wild jungle yams and a green papaya. None of it edible. A note found among a guerrilla's possessions recorded that he had not drunk coffee for over 2 months, and that when he finally found some, there was not enough sugar. Some fighters killed monkeys for meat. The Min Yuan, the civilian support network that had been the insurgency's logistical backbone, was being systematically severed. 450 former new villages are now ordinary Malaysian towns. 1.2 million people live in them. The barbed wire is long gone. The watchtowers are gone. The war that built them is not in the Australian school curriculum. Before Gerald Templer arrived to inherit and expand the program, the High Commissioner he was replacing had to die. The way Sir Henry Gurney died tells something important about how wars that are not supposed to be wars are actually fought. Sir Henry Lovell Goldsworthy Gurney had served the British colonial administration for 3 decades before arriving in Malaya in 1948. On the 6th of October, 1951, he was traveling in his Rolls-Royce Silver Wraith as part of a convoy on the Kuala Kubu Road, heading to the Hill Resort at Fraser's Hill. The convoy consisted of an armored scout car at the front, Gurney's car, a police wireless van, and a Land Rover carrying 6 Malayan policemen in the open back. 8 miles before the ambush site, the wireless van developed engine trouble. The officer in charge advised Gurney to wait. Gurney decided to press ahead. Approximately 60 miles north of Kuala Lumpur, as the convoy rounded a bend in the road, 38 Malayan Communist Party guerrillas opened fire from prepared positions on the hillside. 3 Bren guns, Sten guns, and rifles. The tires of Gurney's car and the Land Rover were immediately punctured. Both vehicles stopped under sustained fire. Gurney pushed his wife and his private secretary, D.J. Staples, into the footwell of the car. Then he opened the door and got out. He walked toward the ambush, not away from it, but toward it, forward into the line of fire, drawing the guerrillas' attention toward himself and away from the car and the people still inside it. He was killed in a roadside ditch. The armored scout car pushed ahead to find help. The guerrillas held their positions for approximately 10 more minutes. Then a bugle call sounded, and they withdrew. When the firing eased, Lady Gurney crawled from the car to find her husband's body. 20 minutes later, reinforcements arrived from a nearby police station. Chin Peng addressed the Gurney ambush directly in his memoir. The attack, he wrote, had been intended to attack a large armed convoy and to seize as many weapons and as much ammunition as the comrades could carry away. His fighters learned the High Commissioner was among the dead from news reports. The killing of the most senior British official in Malaya was not a planned assassination. It was a routine ambush that caught the wrong convoy. What it produced was not routine. The British government appointed, in January of 1952, General Sir Gerald Templer to a position of unprecedented concentrated authority. Simultaneously, High Commissioner and Director of Operations, civilian and military power merged by colonial emergency decree. Harold Briggs, his predecessor in the military role, had died in November of 1951. Templer arrived with a phrase that would travel further than any bomb his forces dropped. "The answer lies not in pouring more soldiers into the jungle," he said, "but in the hearts and minds of the Malayan people. The shooting side of this business is only 25% of the trouble, and the other 75% lies in getting the people of this country behind us." The phrase entered military doctrine. Robert Thompson, the permanent Secretary of Defense for Malaya, and a Chindit veteran, who was one of the chief architects of the civil-military coordination strategy, later went to Vietnam as a counterinsurgency advisor, carrying the framework with him. The Americans applied it there. The Strategic Hamlet program was the Briggs plan, with different terrain, different politics, and a different outcome. What hearts and minds actually comprised in Malaya was the new villages already established by Briggs, the food denial program, a white area and black area system, the Malayan Police Special Branch Intelligence Operation, and the expansion of Malay Home Guard units. A white area was a territory cleared of insurgents. Once designated white, restrictions on the population were lifted, rewarding civilian cooperation with the return of freedom of movement. The black area designation was its opposite: collective restriction, rationing, and curfew applied to communities from which the guerrillas drew support. One scholarly assessment described the overall program as an economic and social policy, laced with political promises, that also served a military purpose. The phrase describes an aspiration. The system was something more coercive than the aspiration implies. By the time Templar left Malaya in October of 1954, most of the territory was secure. The MNLA, which had numbered approximately 8,000 fighters at its peak in 1951, was already in significant decline. The October Resolution of 1951, the MNLA's own internal decision to reduce attacks on economic targets and redirect toward political organization, had not been a tactical choice made from strength. It was an acknowledgement that the military campaign was failing. The outcome of the emergency, when the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment arrived in Penang in October of 1955, was no longer in doubt. The official history states this plainly. What followed for the next 5 years, the years in which Australian ground forces conducted the bulk of their operations, was in the military lexicon a mopping up phase. What mopping up looked like for the men doing it is what the history books rarely describe. The 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, known as 2RIR, arrived having trained at Canungra's Jungle Training Centre in Queensland, the first Australian troops to use the facility since the end of the Second World War. The battalion crossed to the Malayan mainland on the 1st of January, 1956, and began operations as part of the 28th Commonwealth Brigade, primarily in the northern states of Perak and Kedah. Perak, with approximately 50% of its population ethnically Chinese, was regarded by British command as the most persistently active communist territory on the peninsula. The work consisted of this: extensive patrolling through rubber plantations and jungle fringe, checkpoint searches at village entry points, perimeter guard on the new villages, ambush positions maintained for days at a time in the dark and the wet, watching for contacts that rarely came, and one task the record notes without apparent discomfort: stirring the contents of night soil buckets at village exits to check for contraband hidden in the human waste. Weeks of this, with occasional contact. Months of this, with occasional contact. In late April of 1956, 2RAR embarked on Operation Shark North in Perak Province. The objective was to cut insurgent forces from their supply sources through sustained patrolling and checkpoint work. The first phase lasted until late June. More than a month passed without a contact. The evidence suggested the enemy was active in the area. The contact, when it came at a water pipeline. The Sungai Bemban Reservoir supplied the town of Sungai Siput through a pipeline that ran through the jungle fringe. On the morning of the 22nd of June, 1956, a 5-person patrol from A Company, Warren Platoon, led by Corporal John Allan, moved through the jungle alongside that pipeline. They had worked the jungle fringe during the morning and were returning to their patrol base. They were approximately 400 meters from the reservoir. The guerrillas were waiting in prepared positions. They set off a landmine. Then they opened fire with Thompson and Sten submachine guns on the Australians caught on the track. Corporal John Allan was killed as he tried to cross the track. Private Geoffrey Fritz was wounded by the initial blast. Fritz was hit, and he kept firing. He fired his Owen submachine gun at the prepared position while wounded, and he continued until the wounds took him. He died from his injuries. Private Cedric Ingra was also killed. Members of A Company, 2RAR carried Corporal John Allan, Private Geoffrey Fritz, and Private Cedric Ingra on their shoulders at the funeral. 3 men from one platoon, gone on the same morning, on the same track, at the same pipeline. The pipeline ambush was the most costly single engagement of Australian ground forces in the entire Malayan Emergency. It is not well known. 2RAR left Malaya in October of 1957. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, replaced them, trained in Johor, and began patrolling in Perak and Kedah with the same objective: sever the remaining guerrillas from food and movement. In July of 1958, acting on intelligence from a surrendered communist, 3 RAR destroyed several guerrilla camps. On the 20th of November, 1958, another camp was attacked. One of the guerrillas killed in the assault was subsequently identified. He had been among the 38 fighters on the Kuala Kubu Road on the 6th of October, 1951. He had been there when Sir Henry Gurney walked toward the ambush. 7 years later, a 3 RAR patrol in the same jungle state had found him. In April of 1959, the British announced that Perak was secure. The main communist stronghold on the peninsula had been cleared. The 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, replaced 3 RAR in October of 1959 and continued patrolling operations in the north, sometimes crossing into Thailand in pursuit of the MNLA remnants who had retreated there. On the 29th of September, 1956, while 2 RAR was still in Perak, HMS Anzac bombarded a guerrilla campsite from offshore, directed by an Oster spotter aircraft. On the 22nd of January, 1957, HMAS Queenborough and HMAS Quickmatch opened fire on suspected guerrilla positions south of Johor. The reports on both naval actions noted the gunfire as most effective. Air, land, and sea. Australia committed all 3 services to a conflict not permitted to be called a war, and committed them for 13 years, while the infantry battalions patrolled the rubber estates and the ships fired from offshore. 6 Lincoln bombers had been doing something else above the jungle for 8 years. The Lincoln heavy bombers of No. 1 Squadron RAF landed at Tengah Airfield on the western side of Singapore on the 16th of July, 1950. For the first 3 years of the campaign, they were the only Commonwealth heavy bombers in the entire theater. 6 aircraft. Over 8 years, those aircraft and the rotations of crews that flew them would conduct nearly 4,000 sorties and deliver 85% of every bomb dropped in the Malayan Emergency. The Lincoln suited this campaign. Its range was substantial. Its speed, for a heavy bomber, was relatively slow, which was an asset and not a liability when searching for jungle targets whose precise location was uncertain. It carried a heavy bomb load, plus machine guns and 20mm cannon for strafing runs after the ordnance was away. The aircraft flew mainly by day, in formations, or singly, sometimes with RAF bombers alongside. No. 1 Squadron was the only Commonwealth air unit authorized to conduct night operations in the theater, flying missions of up to 6 hours duration, dropping 1 bomb approximately every 30 minutes in harassment raids designed to deny the guerrillas rest and keep them moving. Every strike required approval from the Joint Operations Center in Kuala Lumpur, staffed jointly by military, police, and civilian personnel. The bombing's purpose shifted as the campaign progressed. Initially, it was to kill insurgents. The impracticality of achieving this in operations over dense primary jungle produced a revised objective: harassing the guerrillas, destroying their camps and supply caches, driving them from established positions and into areas where ground forces could engage them. In November of 1953, No. 1 Squadron attacked a jungle camp. The attack killed 3 of Chin Peng's bodyguards and wounded 3 more. Chin Peng was present. He survived. The man with 250,000 Straits dollars on his head was in the camp when the Lincolns came, and he left it alive. In July of 1954, the squadron participated in the largest coordinated air-ground operation of the emergency, Operation Termite, east of Ipoh in the state of Perak, against guerrilla camps in 250 square miles of primary jungle. 5 RAF Lincolns and 6 from an RAF squadron made simultaneous attacks on 2 communist camps. After the bombing runs, 200 British Special Air Service paratroopers dropped from 700 feet, 6 men suffering minor injuries in the descent. Royal Navy helicopters flew in carrying indigenous trackers and heavy radio equipment. The operation was followed by a ground assault and further bombing runs 10 days later. 181 guerrilla camps were destroyed, 13 communists killed, 1 surrendered. The most successful single Lincoln mission came on the 21st of February, 1956, a coordinated strike with Canberra jet bombers of RAF No. 12 Squadron that killed at least 14 communist troops. In July of 1958, No. 1 Squadron was relieved at Tenga by the Canberra jet bombers of No. 2 Squadron RAF, which had deployed to the newly expanded Butterworth Air Base. No. 1 Squadron flew its Lincolns home. 5 of the aircraft undertook a tour of Australia's major cities before returning to Amberley. Darwin, Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, Launceston, Hobart, Canberra, Sydney, Brisbane. The aircraft that had dropped the great majority of every bomb of the campaign flew over the cities of the country that had sent them. The record does not indicate whether the cities were paying particular attention. By September of 1955, the Malayan government had offered the remaining guerrillas an amnesty. Few surrendered. The terms offered no political future. Surrender meant giving up the armed campaign, not entering the political one. Demonstrations across the country showed the population wanted peace. The peace they wanted was not what the amnesty offered. In December of 1955, the most consequential conversation of the entire emergency took place in the town of Baling in Kedah. Chin Peng sat across a table from Tunku Abdul Rahman, who would in less than 2 years lead an independent Malaya. They met to see whether there was a basis for ending the conflict without further killing. Chin Peng's position was straightforward. He would bring his men out of the jungle if the Malayan Communist Party were permitted to enter the political process as a legal organization. He had watched the MCP operate as a legal entity before the emergency. He was asking for the restoration of that status in exchange for ending the armed campaign. The British government, advising Tunku behind closed doors, would not permit it. A legal communist party able to contest elections was not an outcome they were prepared to accept as the price of peace. The talks failed. Tunku withdrew the amnesty offer on the 8th of February, 1956, stating he was unwilling to meet the communists again unless they indicated in advance their intention to make a complete surrender, meaning a surrender without political conditions. At that point, the MNLA had fewer than 500 active fighters. The British had declined to settle with a force they had effectively broken, because settling would have required acknowledging Chin Peng's right to exist in Malayan political life. The emergency continued for 5 more years. By late 1958, approximately 350 fighters remained from what had once been 8,000. The last serious MNLA resistance ended with a surrender in the Telok-Ansan Marsh area in 1958. The remnants retreated to the Thai border. On the 31st of August, 1957, Merdeka, Independence Day, the Federation of Malaya became an independent nation. The anti-colonial rationale of the insurgency, which the MNLA had always described as its primary purpose, ceased to exist. By August of that year, combined MNLA and MIN-UN strength had declined to 1,830. Those who remained faced exile in Thailand or death in the jungle. The conflict that had begun because the British made and then rescinded a promise about citizenship had become, by its end, a conflict that Malayan independence had already made logically incoherent. Chin Peng left South Thailand for Beijing after the emergency ended. He remained in effective exile for the rest of his life. He was never permitted to return to Malaysia. In 2000, he applied to the Malaysian High Court for permission to come home. The court required identity documents he could not produce, and the application failed. He died in Bangkok on the 16th of September, 2013, having led the Malayan Communist Party for 60 years from the age of 22. He signed a peace agreement in Hat Yai, Thailand, on the 2nd of December, 1989, 41 years after the Elful Estate murders, that permitted the remaining MCP members to live in resettlement villages in southern Thailand. He was never allowed to be buried in the country he spent those 60 years trying to govern. The men came home, the 2,000 who would serve on the Thai-Malay border between 1960 and 1966, still had years ahead of them in operations that were not classified as warlike until 1995. But the men for whom the emergency itself was the service returned in 1960 and in the years before it, as the battalions rotated out. The country had been watching other things. The conflict had received minimal press coverage throughout its duration. The Australian public, which had followed the Second World War in daily newspaper accounts, and would follow Vietnam with engagement and fury, had been offered very little of either about Malaya. It was distant, it was complicated, and it had been called, from the beginning, something other than a war. What the emergency produced that outlasted it is more substantial than the commemorative attention it received. The 5 power defense arrangements, formalized in 1971 and still operative today, connected Australia, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, and the United Kingdom in a security framework that grew directly from the relationships built between 1950 and 1960. RAF Base Butterworth, the runway built by No. 2 Airfield Construction Squadron, was handed to Malaysia in 1988. The Kanungra Jungle Training Center doctrine that 2RAR helped establish in 1955 shaped the jungle warfare preparation of every subsequent Australian infantry battalion sent to Southeast Asia, including the battalions that went to Vietnam. Robert Thompson carried the Malayan counterinsurgency framework to Washington as an advisor. The Americans applied it in a country that was not Malaya, in a conflict that was not an emergency, with results the record does not obscure. The counterinsurgency model that emerged from Malaya is still taught in military staff colleges as the canonical Western success of the Cold War era. The teaching tends to emphasize the white areas, the special branch intelligence operation, the political dimension of Merdeka. It tends to omit Batang Kali. It tends to omit 470,000 people behind barbed wire. The model that is taught is the model that is useful. The parts that are not useful are set aside. The Australian War Memorial Roll of Honour names 39 Australians who died during the Malayan Emergency, and a further 3 in post-emergency operations. Each year, on the 31st of August, Malaya and Borneo Veterans Day marks the service of those who were there. The date coincides with Merdeka. Most Australians cannot name it or say what it commemorates. The title of the secondary history published in 1989 remains its own verdict. The accounting that remains is this: Corporal John Norman Allan, Private Geoffrey Fritz, who kept firing after he was hit until he could not. Private Cedric Ingra. 3 men from 1 platoon, a company, 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, dead on the 22nd of June, 1956, beside a water pipeline in Perak, in a conflict with no permanent memorial on Anzac Parade. 39 names on the Roll of Honour. 13 years. 7,000 Australians who served. The Malayan Emergency Memorial in Penang is a large, polished black granite stone inscribed in gold, in memory of the fallen during the emergency campaign 1948 to 1960. The stone does not say war. It was not permitted to say war. It says emergency because it was built within the same legal framework constructed on the morning of the 18th of June, 1948, when the British colonial administration chose the word that kept the insurance premiums intact and made what followed easier, eventually, to forget. If you had a family member who served in Malaya with the RAR battalions, with No. 1 Squadron or No. 38 Squadron on one of the destroyers or carriers in the border operations after 1960, say so in the comments. The history of this conflict belongs to the people who carried it. The naming was the forgetting. The names on the roll of honor are the refutation of the forgetting. That is where they are.